Cyanide Studios' Call of Cthulhu is yet another attempt to adapt the Lovecraft short stories Call of Cthulhu and Shadow over Innsmouth into a video game. Of course, as with the previous attempts at this, specifically Call of Cthulhu Dark Corners of the Earth, it's not a direct adaptation of those stories, but more like a retelling or reimagining with a few liberties taken here and there. The story follows the alcoholic detective Edward Pierce as he's hired to find the missing painter by the name of Sarah Hawkins. Immediately, you'll notice quite a few similarities with the story of this game and Dark Corners of the Earth. Dark Corners of the Earth followed Detective Jack Walters, who was hired to go to the town of Innsmouth to find a missing person as well. As these two games are mostly adapted from Shadow over Innsmouth, you'll find a lot of similarities with these two plots. The only difference here is Edward is sent to the town of Darkwater to find Sarah, but as playing about an hour into the game might show you, Darkwater is essentially just Innsmouth with a few notable differences. The main difference here being, instead of the town being mostly populated by creepy fish people, it consists mostly of fishermen. This is one thing that really stood out to me when I first started playing the game. In Dark Corners, the populace there clearly hated you and wanted you to leave. You were definitely not welcome there. This isn't helped by the fact that all the people giving you the death stare and essentially telling you to fuck off are these creepy fish people. My point is that there's a clear sense of unease and tension in the very beginning of the game that really helps to add to the atmosphere of it. What do we have in Call of Cthulhu 2018? You walk around and talk to people, much like in Dark Corners, but that's really it. It introduces RPG elements like character skill points, and shows that you have dialogue options that dictate what direction the story goes. I just couldn't help but feel like there was so much more going on in the first hour of Dark Corners of the Earth in comparison to this game. Darkwater just seems like a fairly normal little port town. To me, it's pretty bad when a game that's trying to do the same things as a game that came out years prior makes you want to go back and play the other game instead. You might be able to glean from my explanation of the first hour of gameplay that this is going to be a very slow game, and you'd pretty much be right about that. It's not until well after arriving at the Hawkins Manor that things do eventually start to get going. You've got your creepy cults, elder gods, dark secrets the town is trying to keep hidden, etc. Basically everything you could expect from a Lovecraft story. So then what's the problem? Well, the main issue here is the title of the game is Call of Cthulhu, but Cthulhu only shows up for about a second at the very end of the game depending on which ending you get. Sure, the story has plenty of Lovecraftian elements, creatures, references to things within the Lovecraft mythos, but the main elder god from the mythos that this is supposed to be about is barely even in it. And no, I don't consider this a spoiler, as, like I said, Cthulhu is barely even in it. Aside from that detail, the story here is actually fairly solid for the most part. Like I said, it has to do with Edward Pierce learning more and more about the details behind Sarah's disappearance, which directly relate back to the sinister things the town of Darkwater is trying to keep secret. If you know anything about Lovecraft's stories, you already know the direction the plot is going. As he uncovers these secrets, Edward becomes more insane, especially depending on what dialogue options you end up choosing. It's honestly hard to say if these dialogue options really take the story in much of a different direction other than changing the ending you get. There are 4 endings, 2 of which I experienced. I can't speak for the other endings since I'd probably have to replay the game and make different choices in order to get them. So at least there is some replayability here if you really want to see the other 2 endings. 2 of these endings you can easily get by choosing between 2 different options at the very end of the game. Your character points mainly seem to be related to the dialogue options in the game. The other character attributes only really seem to help when you're investigating. Yes, the main gameplay here is investigating crime scenes, sneaking around and talking to people. If you're looking for combat in this game, you're going to be very disappointed. Though this might be a good thing for some people, as combat in Dark Corners of the Earth was one of the worst parts about the game. There is some form of combat at the very end of Call of Cthulhu 2018, but it really couldn't even be called that as you're mostly just shooting defenseless people. One other thing you might be disappointed by with this game is its linearity. Call of Cthulhu is an incredibly linear game. Aside from investigating crimes and occasionally sneaking around, the meat of the gameplay is getting from point A to point B, or removing some obstacle by solving a puzzle or fetching something in order to get to point B. Yes, this has been done in many games before, but here it begins to grow tedious at points. There are 2 particularly annoying segments in this game. The first has to do with Edward going up against an eldritch horror known as the Shambler. This part of the game could have actually been great, as when I first started playing it, I felt some genuine tension because the thing does look genuinely terrifying and can easily spot you when you're trying to sneak around it. The Shambler escapes from a painting, and the only way to get rid of it is to send it back through the painting by using a particular dagger. In this part of the game, you're in a museum that has multiple daggers on display. One of these daggers is the right one. Problem is, however, there's nothing to indicate which dagger is the right one. So you can imagine I went through plenty of trial and error before I eventually found the right dagger. When you do find the right dagger, Edward says this dagger looks different from the rest. Other than that, there's no hint or anything as to which dagger is the one you need. The second is when you have to walk through an endless hallway through multiple doors that lead you back through the same hallway. Basically, it's a maze hallway. The only way to get around some of these doors is to use a different lantern. Using the other lantern reveals paths that were hidden before, and then once they're revealed, you go back and use the other lantern. Not quite as bad as the Shambler segment, but still a bit annoying with how repetitive it gets. This is also the point in the game where the sanity system it has seems to come into play a little bit. If you run out of light with the lantern, you start to hear voices in your head and your vision gets blurry. This is one of the few times in the game where I start to feel some slight tension. Like I said, the sanity system exists, but it's mostly just there for some of the dialogue options later on in the game. Basically, the less sanity you have, the more attuned you are to the language and beliefs of the cult and the Elder Gods. Speaking of the lantern, I found myself barely even using it in the game as there aren't many areas that weren't bright enough to where I couldn't see anything without a light. Oh, and you also have a lighter. Maybe if the game took a similar approach to Amnesia, where darkness is something you actively want to avoid and can mess with your sanity, the lantern would be much more useful. As it stands, I only used it for maybe about 5% of the game. Overall, the gameplay is just serviceable. There's not much here that you haven't seen before or is really going to blow you away. It's all just okay, nothing really special. Also, during the sneaking segments in this game, the AI can be very stupid. You could be standing right in front of them and they wouldn't notice you. That's actually something that happened to me quite a few times when I played this game. It just goes without saying, the sneaking segments are pretty much a joke. The white icon above a character's head is going to indicate whether they can see you or not, and then when it turns red, they can see you and they're going to chase after you. But most of the time you can avoid the AI fairly easily. They're just not very smart. When it comes to graphics and art style, the game looks decent enough. I think the worst part is probably the art style it went for. It has this slightly cartoony but mostly realistic look. It's a bit similar to something like Dishonored if you want to compare it to something. It seems like a bit of a weird decision when you're going for something as dark as Lovecraft. Although it's not something that distracted me all that much, it's noticeable at times. The game looks decent for what it is. I know a small team worked on this game, so I know I should cut them some slack, but apparently if you look hard enough, you'll see quite a few reused models every now and then. This is something I've seen pointed out by other reviewers, and admittedly something I didn't notice when I first played it. I played this game on PC, so I can't speak on the console version, but in terms of performance, the game is mostly consistent in terms of frame rate and runs above 60 frames a second most of the time. The only exception I've found is when you're in the town of Darkwater and the game has to load more character models. Strangely, I did notice a few times my frame rate would inexplicably tank down to 30 frames a second when I would turn a corner while in Darkwater. The culprit for this ended up being the shadows. It seems if you turn them all the way up to Epic, it will cause you problems in this particular area and maybe a few others. I'm running a GTX 1070 and a Core i7 with 16 gigs of RAM, so you would think this wouldn't really cause issues either, especially considering the game doesn't look all that great in the first place. Just know the game might be choppy in some areas, and of course, depending on your hardware, your mileage may vary. One other thing worth mentioning is the load times in the game. Depending on what level the game's loading, the load times can be well over 1 minute. I really can't see much of a reason for this, since I'm not sure what the game is loading considering the linearity of these levels. I can't imagine there's many assets that need to be loaded. Unfortunately, I purchased this game before buying an SSD I just recently installed in my computer and have it installed on one of my other hard drives. I can assure you that if I ran into this problem now, the game would be reinstalled onto that SSD. Hopefully that would at least alleviate this issue. Not that it's something that should be happening in the first place anyway. Call of Cthulhu is a game with a bit of a rocky start, but once it gets into the meat of its story a little over an hour in, it becomes a more interesting narrative experience. The main problem is its gameplay. For the most part, you don't have the sort of tension you'd expect from a game like this. I feel like the atmosphere is there, but there's a few things missing that just don't make this the horrifying experience it should be. I hate to continue comparing it to other games, but this is the best way I can really get my point across. When I played Amnesia, The Dark Descent, and Penumbra for the first time, I felt real apprehension about actually playing those games or going into certain areas because I wasn't sure if there was going to be a monster just around the corner. Those games constantly played with you by assaulting your senses, mainly with sound, to make you believe something was always after you or there was something lurking around right near you. Call of Cthulhu just doesn't do anything like that. While it might tell a somewhat interesting story and is a decent take on the Lovecraft mythos, it just doesn't feel like it provides the horrifying experience I would have expected. If you're looking for something to scratch that itch for a decent Lovecraftian horror game, as much as I hate to say it, I think there are much better options out there. The aforementioned Call of Cthulhu Dark Corners of the Earth was released years ago, and despite some pretty serious technical issues and inconsistencies with the gameplay, is a generally more memorable game with some standout moments. There's not many of those I can really point to with Call of Cthulhu 2018, aside from maybe one or two things. I can't help but feel a bit torn on this game. There's plenty here for a fan of Lovecraft to enjoy in terms of its references and its plot. However, at the end of the day, the gameplay is really what matters above all else, and what's here just really isn't anything to write home about. I admit I was one of the people hyped for this game before it came out. I was expecting a tense, harrowing experience similar to Dark Corners of the Earth or Amnesia, but that's not exactly what we got. All this being taken into consideration, I'm going to have to give Call of Cthulhu a 6 out of 10. The game isn't necessarily bad, so I wouldn't feel right giving it anything lower, but I wouldn't call it a memorable experience either, and not something I'm really planning on going back to anytime soon. Right now you can get the game for about $40 on PC, but I would say that's way too high a price for a game like this. It's a very short experience that will only take you about 5 to 6 hours to get through. There's not nearly enough here to justify a price like that. If the game were $20, I could recommend it, but at that price I would advise against buying this game at the moment unless you're a Lovecraft fanatic. I just happen to have been one of the people that bought into the hype for this game and ended up pre-ordering it, albeit at a somewhat discounted price. I don't doubt that Cyanide Studios wanted to make a decent game here, and I think there's definitely a lot of potential, but ultimately what we have is a game that's average at best and won't really do much to convince you to replay it aside from seeing how some of your other choices might play out. And like I said, 2 of the endings you can view just by making a different final choice at the end. As for the other 2 choices, I can't say. However, I can personally tell you I don't have much interest in going back through the game for just that reason. Regardless, I hope you all enjoyed this review. Let me know what you thought of the game if you've played it, and if you felt the same way I did about it. Until next time, I'll see you all later.